In my last video, I talked about Speke and Burton in 1858 reaching Lake Victoria and the source of the Nile. There was a lot else going on in the Victorian era British Empire in the world of scientific debate and discovery at that same time. For example, Darwin's publication of On the Origin of the Species. For a start, that was published in 1859. The British Association for the Advancement of Science had their annual meeting in the summer of 1860 in Oxford, and some of it was held in a brand new museum, the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. I've done a few videos of Oxford, but haven't yet shown downtown Oxford, so this is a good time to look at the city and see where things are. So from the top of the University Church of St. Mary, you can really see some of the best overall views of the city. This is looking north. That big building right in front of us is a library named the Radcliffe Camera. The Tom Engineering Building is just visible behind it. It looks far away, but it's about 3/4 of a mile, 10-minute walk. The Sheldonian Theater is nearby. Oxford University is a collection of 43 individual colleges. You apply to the college, you live in the college, you do tutorials within the college that you're in. So here is Brasenose College that's over 500 years old. And looking a bit more northeast, the big college right below us is All Souls. And about a 10-minute walk straight up Parks Road from here is the Oxford Museum of Natural History. You can't quite see it because it's just behind the edge of Radcliffe Camera from this angle. Work finished on the museum around 1858. I'll talk more about the building of the museum in my next video, and I'll do a lot more, of course, on Oxford overall in future videos. But back to 1860. The British Association for the Advancement of Science had their annual meeting in the summer of that year, and evolution, Darwin's theories were not officially on the agenda. But there was a session John William Draper was scheduled to give, an hour and a half lecture on the intellectual development of Europe in this newly built museum. The Bishop of Oxford at that time, Samuel Wilberforce, was expected to use the discussion portion of this lecture to destroy Darwin's theories. So over 700 people showed up to hear this lecture, despite it being a session most otherwise would have been happy to miss. So many people showed up that they had to move the session to a yet unfinished room at the top floor of the museum, the Radcliffe Library. You can't visit the museum today because it's used for collections and research, but you can go to the top floor of the museum and you can certainly stand outside. When the lecture was over, Wilberforce asked one of the evolution defenders, Thomas Huxley, which side of his family was descended from apes, his mother's side or his father's side. And Huxley famously rose up and said, "It is far better to be descended from apes than to be descended from a man who possesses means and influence and yet uses them for ridicule and to obscure the truth," which is about as raucous as it got for a gathering of naturalists in the mid-1800s. But it was a moment in science when a younger generation of scientists found the opportunity to completely break science free from the constraints of religion. So up to that point, science and religion had existed as uncomfortable cohabitants. Science left the mystery of man and man's soul to religion, while changing how we think about planets and plants, rocks, animals, and everything else. There are 4 or 5 main players that led to the moment of this great debate at the museum. The first is Charles Darwin himself. He wasn't actually there at the conference. He didn't want any part in this particular conflict. He also had health problems that kept him from doing much besides writing anyway. But he was conflict averse in general. In his book On the Origin of the Species, he was specifically silent on the topic of the evolution of man, but anyone reading it would naturally draw the implication that man had evolved as all other species did. I mean, Darwin himself wanted a theory that was inclusive of religion and God, but he also wasn't willing to bend the evidence to include God, unlike other scientists at the time, such as his adversary, Richard Owen. Darwin was 27 years old when he completed his 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle, and then he had his theory of evolution within a couple of years after that, by 1838. But he waited 20 years before publishing it, and at least in the initial years, the delay was out of respect for Christianity. But waiting 20 years at that time was a big deal because many other scientists were publishing about topics of evolution similar to evolution as well. Many believed that God shaped the course of evolution, but Darwin was unique in his understanding that small variations, small accidental variations occur, and as all species are in a constant struggle for survival against inhospitable environments and their competitors for scarce resources, if any small variation happens to give someone a slightly better chance of survival and reproduction, then that trait will be passed along, and over time the species will develop to include more of those traits that are advantageous, while the traits that are less advantageous to survival die out over time. So this game between chance and survival was his insight. But it was quite a thing to wait 20 years, at a time when any other scientist could well have also discovered it and beaten him to publication. In the middle of those 20 years, Darwin's 9-year-old daughter Annie began to complain of stomach pains similar to the ones that he suffered with, and she died within a year. And for Darwin, that was the end of his belief in God. It solidified for him that the universe isn't a place of morality or justice, but just a struggle for survival. Well, so that's Darwin, the most important contributor to the great debate in Oxford in 1860, who wasn't even present. But who was there? The second most important character in these events is the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce. Darwin said something in his book On the Origin of the Species that Samuel Wilberforce jumped on. And what he said was that you can see evidence of evolution in the work of plant and animal breeders who breed future generations based on characteristics that they want. And Wilberforce says, yes, but doing so only makes minor and temporary changes, and no one has ever made a new species that way, which may be true, but Darwin's point was more about millions and millions of changes over generations after generations, so hundreds of thousands of years, a scale that is very different from anything that domestic breeders were doing. So perhaps it was an analogy that caused more confusion than clarity. Another challenge with Darwin's theory, which Darwin spent time discussing and apologizing for in the book, but which Wilberforce also jumped on. If humans descended from apes millions of years ago, where are the fossil records showing the transitional progression from one species to another? And, of course, fossil records are imperfect histories, and Darwin didn't have all the fossils he'd hoped to have to show how evolution progressed within species over time. Wilberforce was also, of course, vehemently pro-God. He was married. In the mid and late 1830s, he and his wife lost 2 of their children, and then she died in 1841. But unlike Darwin, he took these events as signs to redouble his commitment to God. He died in 1873. I found by accident this clipping from the Illustrated London News in the Bodleian Library after his death. It says a memorial cross was erected where he died, southwest of London, in a spot that is today part of the National Trust, the Abinger Roughs and Netley Park. The third most important character, Thomas Henry Huxley. One of the younger scientists, he had been studying the similarities between gorillas and human skulls, and for him, Darwin's book was the theory that he needed, and he was its most vocal defender. So where Darwin was unwilling to extend his theory into the evolution of man, Huxley made applying it to man his main mission. It was Huxley who got up and said it is far better to be descended from apes than from the likes of you. in response to Wilberforce. But in the moment, in actuality, his voice was very soft, and he didn't really defend much of anything related to evolution in the meeting. But it was the final character, perhaps Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, who did, and he had the last word. Darwin took one trip on the HMS Beagle early in his life. Hooker, on the other hand, spent years exploring India, Nepal, the Antarctic, and Darwin benefited from his research and what he brought back. I mean, he made a lengthy speech defending Darwinism, but his contributions are mostly forgotten because Huxley's short quip was the one that was captured in the next day's newspapers. Well, in my last video, I covered another famous Victorian debate, the Speke-Burton debate. In my next video, I'll stay at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History and meet 3 Irish stonemasons who carved the interior and exterior of the museum. See you then.